Hey guys, tonight we step into the shadowed chambers of medieval Europe, where marriage was less about romance and more about duty, law, and fear. We'll explore why so many women dreaded their wedding nights, caught between the church's rules, family expectations, and the ever-watchful eyes of their communities. It's a story of resilience, silence, and survival in a world where a single night could shape an entire lifetime. So before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy the history and storytelling I share here. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. It's always incredible to see how far this community reaches across the globe. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and get comfortable. Let's journey back together into a night that was anything but romantic. Let's set the scene. A wedding night in medieval Europe was never only private. It sat at the seam between two legal states and drew the eyes of law, theology, medicine, and neighbors. The church taught that marriage was formed by free words of consent, yet many jurists also treated sexual union as the act that sealed a bond beyond human power to dissolve. In that framework, a bride's body became pledge, proof, and public matter at once. Fear did not come from a single cause. It rose from the weight of rules, the noise of custom, and the knowledge that one moment could decide a lifetime. Canon lawyers of the 12th and 13th centuries debated whether words or bodies made a marriage. Their synthesis favored consent as the form of the sacrament, but held that consummation gave a special firmness that courts would not undo. Consummation could resolve disputes over earlier promises, transform a conditional betrothal into a binding union, and defeat a family's attempt to reverse an alliance. A hesitant bride might know that one act could close doors that law otherwise left ajar, which sharpened anxiety as the feast ended and the house grew quiet. The community's gaze made the moment harsher. In many towns and villages, the couple's bed was ritually blessed, or at least publicly escorted, with jokes, songs, and gestures that announced fertility to those present. The rite could be playful, but it staged a private threshold as a social test, and the girl who had left her mother's bench that morning became a figure on display by evening. Even where bedding was modest, the expectation that others would see or hear proof of consummation set nerves on edge and told the bride that her comfort mattered less than the alliance her marriage promised. Medical teaching did not soften things. Humoral theory pictured bodies as mixtures of heat and moisture. Many writers described women as colder and wetter, and some medical compendia insisted that female pleasure aided conception. That idea put a new burden on the bride. If a child did not come, whispers could blame her reluctance or her failure to reach the response that physicians said nature required. Manuals of women's medicine also spoke of virginity, hymens, and signs that midwives might inspect, which turned the first night into a trial with witnesses waiting on the other side of the door. Age and asymmetry sharpened unease. Noble girls were often married in mid-adolescence for reasons of land and alliance, while many peasants and townsfolk married later, sometimes in their 20s. In either case, the gap between a new wife's inexperience and a husband's expectations could be wide. Household guides written by men urged obedience and patience and presented endurance as a path to honor. Such counsel centered a husband's authority, not a young woman's comfort, and it told her that the best wedding night was a quiet one that served household order. The religious calendar narrowed choice. Penitential writers and later canonists listed seasons and days when abstinence was expected. Within the permitted times, spouses owed one another the conjugal debt, a term that turned tenderness into obligation and refusal into sin. The first night opened that ledger. A request could be framed as right. A refusal could carry fault. A bride who had barely learned her husband's voice could find herself judged against rules that spoke in the grammar of duty rather than care. Later legend made memory crueler. Tales claimed that lords took a tenant's bride on the first night. Research finds no evidence that such a rite existed as general law. The power of the story shows what people feared power could do with a woman's body, but the truth is that authority had other tools. Families pressed daughters into contracts, parishes recorded unions, lords levied marriage fines, priests urged submission. The sum of ordinary pressures was heavy enough without any invented right. The law left narrow exits. A union made without true consent could be challenged, and a marriage never consummated could sometimes be dissolved or declared null. Courts heard suits about force, fear, pre-contracts, and impotence, yet pursuing such remedies required witnesses, money, and the nerve to speak of intimate things before clerics and scribes. For a new wife, the knowledge that consummation would close even those thin doors made the approach to the bed the highest point of risk in the whole ceremony. Imagine a market town at the close of the 14th century. The feast has faded, and the house carries the warm scent of ale and ash. A young woman named Alice sits on the edge of a curtained bed. On a chest lies a linen sheet her aunt arranged with care, and beside it a ribbon that will later be knotted to mark the chamber as altered. 3 companions of her husband finish a last cup in the hall, trading praise for his prospects. Alice thinks of the ring that slid onto her finger at the church door, and of the words she was told to speak. She also thinks of the promise her father made yesterday to settle a boundary quarrel by confirming the dowry. The door latch lifts. Her husband enters with the shy gravity of a farmer, who knows that men in the hall will listen for laughter or silence. He speaks a blessing he learned by rote. She replies softly and watches his hands tremble like hers. There are stories she has heard of tenderness that grows with time and stories of bruised quiet. She does not know which story will be hers. She only knows that every rule, from canon to calendar, has prepared her less for comfort than for compliance. Behind the wall, the cups fall still. She closes her eyes and steps into a future that strangers, cousins, clerks, and authors have already tried to write for her. This is why so many medieval women would have dreaded their wedding nights. The dread was not simple fear of the unknown. It was the reasonable response of a young person facing a threshold made heavy by theology, medical theory, public custom, and law, each of which claimed a piece of her body and her will. Some couples learned tenderness and made space for joy. Others did not. Every bride knew that the first lines of that tale would be written before she had any power to revise them, and that knowledge alone could chill the heart on a night meant to warm it. If one asks why medieval brides carried dread into the marriage chamber, the answer is bound to daily realities of law, medicine, and culture. But to understand fully, one must step through a single day and watch its unfolding hour by hour. The morning began in the churchyard, where the parish priest waited in surplice and stole. Bells had been rung, neighbours summoned, and the bride herself led from her parents' home. Many such brides were scarcely more than children. In aristocratic families, marriage was less about romance and more about securing alliances and property. Girls of 12 to 15 years were often wed to men far older. Even among peasants, while brides might be older, the difference in experience between husband and wife could be stark. The imbalance carried forward into the night, where innocence met expectation. The ceremony stressed obedience. The words of the ritual bound the wife to be buxom and bonaire to her husband, a phrase that implied not only kindness, but compliance. The husband vowed protection and maintenance, but the burden placed upon the wife was heavier. She was to yield, to serve, and to submit. It was no coincidence that the first act of their shared household life was consummation, for only by that act was the marriage regarded as indissoluble. Thus, as she knelt at the altar, the bride already knew the weight of the night to come. At the feast, laughter covered unease. Guests drank deep, sang bawdy songs, and teased the new couple with jests about the bedchamber. Such merriment was not idle, it was ritual. The bedding ceremony that followed was a performance, where neighbours and kin escorted the pair to their chamber with torches and shouts. In some places, attendants lingered until the couple was in bed, and only then withdrew with knowing winks. The symbolism was clear. The community had delivered the bride to her husband, and her body was no longer her own. Within the chamber, customs varied. A priest might bless the bed, sprinkling holy water and reciting prayers for fertility. The linens were sometimes marked or preserved, for they could serve as evidence of consummation. Failure to consummate was not a private matter. It could be grounds for annulment, inheritance disputes, or scandal that touched entire families. The sheets themselves became instruments of proof, and the bride's body became the arena upon which questions of law and lineage were fought. Medieval medicine gave no solace. Physicians taught that women's bodies were made to be penetrated, their humours needing heat and balance supplied by the male. Writers such as Albertus Magnus argued that female desire was both unruly and dangerous, yet also necessary for conception. A paradox emerged. Brides were told to be modest and chaste, but also warned that without pleasure no child might come. Thus, if children failed to appear, blame fell easily upon the woman. She had not played her part with sufficient willingness. Such beliefs transformed the wedding night from a private moment into an ordeal, where failure could echo through years of suspicion. The Church compounded fear by turning sex into both sacrament and snare. Theologians spoke of the marital debt, a duty spouses owed one another whenever asked. For a bride, that meant refusal could be framed as sin. Manuals of confession instructed priests to inquire whether wives resisted their husbands. Even on the first night, the expectation of obligation was already present. She was bound, not only by law and custom, but by conscience and salvation. The risk of violence was not small. Some men taught that mastery was theirs by right, regarded their bride's fear as irrelevant. Chronicles and court records testify to complaints of cruelty, yet the avenues for redress were limited. A woman could claim force at the altar to annul a marriage, but once consummation had taken place, the plea carried little weight. Thus, the first night marked the end of her last chance to resist. Imagine, then, a bride in the year 1274, in a manor on the edge of Normandy. She has been married to a knight twice her age. Her hands are raw from clutching rosary beads as the revellers pushed her toward the chamber. Her mother whispered a prayer, her aunt gave advice she scarcely understood. Now she sits alone on a carved oak bed. Outside, the laughter fades. She hears boots on the stair. She knows that the union of two estates, the peace of two quarrelling families, perhaps even the inheritance of lands yet unborn, rests upon what will happen in this small room tonight. The pressure of church, law, and kin weighs on her shoulders heavier than the woolen cloak around her. This was why the medieval wedding night carried dread. It was never just between two people. It was a performance for family, a test for neighbors, an article for law, and a sacrament before God. For the bride, it was the point where fear and duty converged, and where her body became the text upon which society wrote its will. The dread of medieval brides was shaped not only by the weight of custom, but also by the silence that surrounded them. In chronicles, sermons, and household guides, women's voices are rarely heard directly. Instead, men, clerics, physicians, lords, spoke for them. To uncover what a bride might have felt, we must read between the lines of those texts, listening for traces of anxiety in rules, remedies, and court cases. One of the clearest signs of this silence is in the legal records. In medieval canon courts, cases of annulment or impotence reveal much about the pressure of consummation. A woman might bring suit claiming her husband was impotent, or a husband might allege his wife had hidden some defect. These were not just private grievances. They were trials where judges asked blunt questions about bodies, where midwives were called as expert witnesses, and where communities whispered about the couple's failures. For a new bride, the knowledge that her body might one day be subject to such scrutiny only deepened her unease on that first night. The proof of virginity was another cruel expectation. Families prized a blood-stained sheet as evidence that their daughter had been whole at marriage. Yet medical writers knew, and many modern historians remind us, that bleeding was never guaranteed. Hymens differ, and some girls might have broken theirs long before marriage through riding, work, or accidents. A bride who did not bleed risked suspicion, shame, or even repudiation. Thus, the wedding night was not only a personal trial but a public test, with consequences for her honor and her family's standing. Cultural rituals amplified the tension. In parts of France and Germany, peasants gathered outside the bridal chamber, singing ribald verses or banging pots to encourage fertility. In England, neighbors sometimes escorted the couple to bed with torches, joking loudly about what was to follow. These rituals were meant to bind the community together, yet for the bride, they erased any chance of privacy. What should have been a tender threshold became a spectacle. Even in the dim silence of the chamber, she could feel the echo of voices pressing upon her. Literature of the age reflected these expectations. Fabliaux, short, often bawdy tales from France, mocked women who were timid or unresponsive on their wedding nights, portraying them as laughable or even deceitful. Courtly romances praised love but still assumed obedience, and saints' lives often contrasted the purity of virgins who refused marriage with the compromised state of wives. In every genre, the message was clear. A woman's value lay in her sexual state, and her wedding night was the hinge upon which that value turned. Nor did the Church offer comfort. While it exalted marriage as a sacrament, it also preached celibacy as the holier path. Priests warned couples against lust, yet insisted that sex within marriage was a duty owed to one another. This double message created an impossible bind for brides. They were told to be modest, yet responsive, pure yet fertile, obedient yet devout. The contradictions made the wedding night a puzzle with no solution that could fully satisfy both God and man. Consider a young bride in 14th century Flanders. Her father, a weaver, has married her to the son of a cloth merchant. She knows the match is practical. It binds two workshops and promises prosperity. The parish priest blessed the union that morning. Now, after the feasting, her husband leads her into the chamber. The bed is piled with wool blankets and fresh straw beneath. On the chest at its foot lies a sheet her mother brought to be kept as proof. She lowers herself onto the bedding, heart pounding. Outside, boys still sing a crude rhyme about brides. She knows her husband expects evidence. She prays silently that her body will cooperate, that she will bleed, that no one will whisper of shame tomorrow. This was the cruel paradox. A bride's future could hinge on a bodily reaction she could not control. Even the most willing and obedient wife could be undone by nature. And the knowledge of that possibility, combined with the lack of choice, the imbalance of age, and the ever-watchful eyes of community, made the medieval wedding night less a celebration and more an ordeal. To move from general customs to concrete examples, we turn to the archives. Medieval courts, both secular and ecclesiastical, preserve voices, often fractured, often filtered, that give us glimpses of real wedding nights and their consequences. In the canon law records of York, one case from the early 14th century involved a woman who claimed her marriage should be annulled because consummation never occurred. Her husband, she alleged, was impotent, and thus the union could not be binding. The court did not simply accept her word. They summoned physicians, midwives, and neighbors to testify. In some cases, humiliating tests were ordered, where men were required to demonstrate arousal before witnesses, or where women were examined by matrons. For a bride, this meant that her private fear of an unsuccessful night might later be dragged into the open, dissected before strangers with ink and parchment. In another record from Bologna, a husband claimed his wife was not a virgin on their wedding night. He presented the unstained sheets to the court as evidence. The wife's family argued vigorously, insisting that not all women bled and that the accusation was slanderous. Still, the case shows how the first night of marriage could become a battlefield of honor. A woman's reputation, and often her very survival within her husband's household, could be jeopardized by the absence of something as fragile and uncertain as a drop of blood. Noble households carried these expectations to greater extremes, because lineage and inheritance were at stake. Chroniclers tell of lords who demanded immediate proof of consummation to secure dynastic claims. In some courts, attendants even lingered outside the chamber, listening for sounds that would confirm the act. The sheets might be paraded before witnesses the following morning. If doubt lingered, rival claimants could use it as fuel in disputes over dowries or succession. For the noble bride, her body was not only a vessel of alliance, but also a seal upon which estates and titles rested. Peasant communities, though less formal, could be equally harsh. In small villages, gossip carried enormous weight. A bride who was thought not to have performed on her wedding night might be mocked or ostracized. Folklore and song reflect this cruel humor. Verses survive that ridiculed new wives as more cold or clumsy if they failed to please their husbands. Such ridicule was not harmless jest. In tightly woven communities, mockery could follow a woman for years, branding her as a poor wife and lowering her family's standing. There are also accounts of resistance. In some rare cases, women delayed or refused consummation, hoping to preserve independence or avoid unwanted unions. Hagiographies, stories of saints, are filled with brides who prayed for divine intervention on their wedding nights, sometimes claiming miraculous preservation of their virginity. While these tales were often exaggerated, they show that medieval audiences understood the dread brides felt and imagined escape only through miracle. But miracles were scarce in real life. A more common recourse was annulment on grounds of force or lack of consent at the altar. Yet such cases were rarely successful once the marriage had been consummated. For this reason, many women feared that their wedding night would end not only their maidenhood, but also their last legal recourse. Once the act was done, their future was sealed. Imagine again a young bride in 12th century Paris. She has been married by arrangement to a merchant. On her wedding night, she resists her husband's approach, weeping that she was forced into the union. But when the case later reaches the bishop's court, the judge asks only one question: did you consent? And when it is revealed that the marriage was consummated, her plea is dismissed. The act of that first night, no matter how unwilling, becomes the proof that binds her. It is in these records that we see the core truth. The medieval wedding night was never only about love or desire. It was evidence, testimony, a public document written on the body of the bride. And because she knew that every gesture and every outcome might one day be dragged before the eyes of priests, lords, or neighbors, her dread was not only natural, it was inevitable. If courts and customs made the wedding night into a public trial, then medical and religious writings supplied the language by which that trial was judged. To understand why medieval brides so often dreaded this night, we must examine what the learned world taught about women's bodies, sex, and duty. Medieval medicine drew heavily from classical authorities, Hippocrates, Galen, and later Arabic commentators like Avicenna. Physicians believed that the human body was governed by the balance of four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Men were thought to be hotter and drier, women colder and wetter. This humoral difference was used to justify hierarchy. If men were heat and spirit, women were matter and moisture, passive rather than active. The act of consummation was framed within this theory. The husband's warmth was said to perfect the wife's cold matter, giving life to children. In such a view, her role was secondary. her body an instrument, not an equal partner. Yet paradoxically, medical writers also argued that women's pleasure was necessary for conception. The 12th century physician Constantinus Africanus repeated the belief that women contributed seed alongside men, and that orgasm ensured its emission. This placed a terrible burden on brides. They were expected to experience pleasure, yet no one taught them what that meant or gave them a choice in seeking it. If a child did not come, suspicion might fall on the wife. Her body had failed, or her heart had been cold. The weight of reproduction, and therefore the success of the marriage, was laid upon her shoulders from the very first night. Religious writings intensified this burden by framing sex in terms of sin and salvation. Theologians like Peter Lombard and Thomas Aquinas emphasized that marriage was a remedy for lust, not a license for indulgence. A bride was told to approach her husband without passion, to fulfill her duty quietly, and to guard against excessive enjoyment. Too little desire threatened fertility, too much threatened damnation. The contradictions were crushing. Brides were asked to be modest yet fertile, silent yet responsive, obedient yet not lustful. No wonder the night became a source of fear. Confessional manuals reveal how priests interrogated these matters. Parishioners were instructed to confess not only adultery or fornication, but also whether they had resisted the marital debt. Wives were warned that refusal was sinful, unless for sickness, pilgrimage, or other grave cause. Husbands were told they must honor their wives' needs, but always with the implication that their right to ask outweighed her right to refuse. From the very first night, then, a bride understood that she had entered a state where her body was not fully her own. Popular culture absorbed and echoed these teachings. Proverbs reminded brides that a wife is but half a person without her husband. Ballads mocked women who resisted their husband's will. At the same time, miracle stories praised saints who refused consummation entirely, holding virginity as holier than marriage. Ordinary women were caught between two models, one that demanded obedience in bed, another that exalted refusal as divine. Both undermined the possibility of a balanced, consensual partnership. Imagine a bride in late 13th century England. She has overheard sermons warning that lust is deadly, yet also knows her mother's stern reminder that she must give her husband children. She has no education in pleasure, no framework for negotiation, and no right to say no. All she has are contradictory teachings ringing in her ears as she approaches her bed. That she must give herself, that she must not enjoy herself too much, that she must bleed, that she must conceive. Each command pulls in a different direction, but all point toward her body as the battleground. The dread, then, was not merely of pain or embarrassment. It was of failure. Failure to satisfy her husband, failure to conceive, failure to prove her virginity, failure to live up to the church's impossible standards. On a night when joy should have been possible, the medieval bride was weighed down by fears planted by physicians, priests, and poets alike. The weight of dread pressed most heavily where marriage was least a matter of choice. In much of medieval Europe, weddings were contracts between families rather than unions of affection. This truth applied across social classes, though the stakes differed. Among nobles, marriages cemented alliances, secured land, and strengthened claims to titles. Among peasants, they ensured survival, joining fields and flocks, or sealing debts and dowries. For the bride, the wedding night marked the point at which all these bargains came to rest upon her body. Age differences deepened the fear. Noble girls were often married as soon as they reached puberty. A bride of 12 or 13 might be paired with a man in his 30s or 40s, whose first wife had died in childbirth, or who sought heirs to secure his line. Peasant women usually married later, sometimes in their late teens or 20s, but the imbalance of experience was still stark. A young woman, newly taken from her father's house, might be placed with a husband who had traveled, fought, or traded for years. The imbalance turned the chamber into a place of testing, where innocence met seasoned expectation. Family expectation loomed as another shadow. The bride's relatives saw her not simply as a daughter, but as a vessel of family honor. Her virginity confirmed the family's respectability. Her fertility ensured the continuity of its name. Parents often arranged matches with little thought for their child's comfort. A dowry could be settled, a boundary dispute eased, a debt forgiven, all by placing a girl in a man's bed. The girl herself had no voice. On the wedding night, she knew that her family's future rested on her willingness to endure. Mothers sometimes offered advice, but it was practical rather than consoling. Chronicles and folklore record mothers whispering counsel to their daughters, how to behave, how to remain still, how to avoid offending their husbands. These instructions, passed in kitchens or whispered during the feast, reveal both care and resignation. They acknowledged the daughter's fear, but accepted that she must bear it. Thus, maternal love often translated into preparation for submission. Consider the case of Margaret Beaufort, mother of Henry VII of England. Married at 12 to Edmund Tudor, she became pregnant almost immediately. Childbirth nearly killed her. Her small frame and young age left her scarred for life. Though she survived, she bore no more children. Margaret's story, well documented by historians, illustrates how early marriage and the pressure to produce heirs could permanently shape a woman's body and destiny. For countless unnamed brides of humbler status, similar fates unfolded in silence. Beyond age and family pressure lay the psychological toll of sudden displacement. A bride left the only home she had known, often moving into her husband's family household, where every eye was upon her. She might not know her husband well, or at all, before the wedding day. The night was her introduction to both her new role as wife and her new household. Failure to please could mean not only marital strife, but also humiliation in front of in-laws. The pressure to perform, combined with the loneliness of leaving her own kin, could make the chamber feel less like a sanctuary and more like a prison. Fear was compounded by stories passed down through gossip. Women heard tales of rough or cruel husbands, of brides who were mocked the next morning for failing to bleed, of wives cast aside for barrenness. Whether true or not, these stories became cautionary lessons. Every bride carried them into the chamber, imagining her own future written in those whispered accounts. In this way, the medieval wedding night became a crucible of age, arrangement, and expectation. The bride entered not as an equal partner in love, but as the bearer of family strategy, the seal of alliances, and the promise of heirs. Her dread was not only of the act itself, but of the immense web of duty that closed around her as she crossed the threshold of her husband's bed. If the family's demands and the husband's authority weighed heavily on the medieval bride, the community's gaze pressed just as hard. In village, town, or castle, marriage was not a private affair. It was a social contract, witnessed, celebrated, and often mocked by the people around it. The wedding night, in particular, was made into a ritualized event where neighbors, friends, and kin intruded upon the threshold of intimacy. The bedding ceremony was one of the clearest expressions of this intrusion. After the feast, guests escorted the couple to their chamber with torches, shouts, and laughter. In parts of France, they sang ribald verses. In Germany, they banged pots and pans. In England, they offered mock blessings laced with jokes. The couple might be undressed by attendants or tucked into bed under the watchful eyes of family. Even when modesty prevailed and the door was shut, the ritual had already turned the first night into a communal performance. Such practices were not merely frivolous. They reinforced the community's claim upon the marriage. Fertility was not just a private hope, it was a public necessity, ensuring heirs for noble families and stability for peasant households. By intruding into the chamber, the community reminded the couple that their union served society as much as themselves. The bride, seated at the center of this ritual, could feel the full force of communal expectation pressing upon her as she faced her new husband. Gossip was another powerful tool of surveillance. Villages thrived on stories, and the details of a wedding night, true or imagined, were quickly shared. A bride who failed to bleed, or whose husband complained of her reluctance, might find herself the subject of whispers for years. Songs and jokes carried reputations far beyond the chamber walls. For the bride, this meant that even in the most private moment, she could not escape the judgment of others. Communities also preserved proof. In some regions, sheets were displayed the next morning as evidence of consummation. Servants, midwives, or relatives might be called upon to inspect them. While not universal, this practice reflects the degree to which the private act was transformed into public testimony. A bride who failed to produce the expected signs could face ridicule, suspicion of prior unchastity, or even annulment proceedings. The intrusion was not always hostile. In some cases, the community framed its involvement as protective or celebratory. Blessings, songs, and gifts were offered to ensure fertility and prosperity. But even in its most benevolent form, the custom still robbed the bride of privacy. Her first night as a wife belonged not only to her husband, but also to the collective gaze of her neighbors. Imagine a village in the Rhineland, late 14th century. The couple has been feasted and is now escorted to their chamber. Young men sing bawdy songs outside the door, while women joke about the bride's innocence. The chamber itself is small, lit by flickering candles. As the door closes, the bride knows that half the village waits outside, listening. Their laughter, their songs, and their expectation seep through the walls, turning the act into a performance. She feels the weight of their presence as keenly as the gaze of her new husband. This ever-watchful community meant that a medieval bride's dread was not confined to her own anxieties or her family's demands. It extended outward, encompassing the whole society that claimed a stake in her body and her future. The wedding night was less a personal beginning than a public rite of passage, where the bride's role as wife and mother was tested under the eyes of all. The dread of the medieval wedding night was sharpened most of all by the reality of coercion. Consent, though celebrated in church doctrine as the foundation of marriage, was often little more than a formality when set against the weight of family arrangements, property concerns, and social expectation. Many brides knew the words they spoke at the altar were not their own. On the wedding night, this lack of real choice translated directly into fear of what awaited them behind the bedchamber door. The imbalance of power was profound. Husbands entered marriage with legal, social, and religious authority on their side. Wives, by contrast, were instructed to yield. The marital debt doctrine gave husbands the right to demand sex at will, framing refusal as sinful. Priests and jurists alike reinforced this notion. To resist was disobedience not only to the husband, but to God. For a bride, the knowledge that her no carried no weight turned the chamber into a site of compelled submission. This lack of autonomy often meant violence. Chronicles and private letters occasionally reveal cases of brutality where men boasted of breaking their wives' resistance. Though such acts were rarely punished, their echoes survive in court petitions where women complained of cruelty or sought annulment on grounds of fear. But these petitions were exceptional. Most endured in silence, their suffering hidden behind the walls of the household. The danger was compounded for very young brides. Girls of 12 or 13, scarcely past childhood, were expected to endure the demands of grown men. Childbirth already carried grave risks, and when forced upon bodies not yet mature, it could prove deadly. Stories like that of Margaret Beaufort, pregnant at 12, nearly killed in labor, were repeated across generations, though rarely recorded for common women. For these brides, the wedding night was not only terrifying but life-threatening. Even for older women, coercion left scars. Many brides entered marriage with no knowledge of sex, taught only to expect pain. The sudden imposition of force, without tenderness or explanation, could turn fear into trauma. In a world that prized obedience, such trauma had no outlet. Husbands were rarely expected to cultivate affection. Indeed, some moralists warned against too much gentleness, fearing it would encourage lust. For the wife, that meant pain was often normalized, silence expected. The concept of raptus in medieval law shows how muddled ideas of consent were. The Latin term could mean both abduction and rape, but courts often treated it primarily as a crime against property, the dishonoring of a family or the violation of a contract, rather than a crime against the woman herself. In this legal climate, the bride's suffering on her wedding night held little weight. Her body was a means of sealing agreements, not an autonomous self. Imagine a young noblewoman in 11th century Normandy. Married at 14 to secure her father's lands, she has spent the day under the watchful eyes of family and guests. Now, as the chamber door closes, she sees a man twice her age approach her with the confidence of one entitled by law, religion and custom. She hesitates, pleading for time. He does not stop. To him, the act is duty. To her, it is violation. By morning, the household will speak of a successful union. Only she will carry the memory of terror. This is the stark reality of why so many medieval women would have dreaded their wedding nights. Consent was nominal, violence common, and silence enforced. What modern readers might call assault was, in many medieval contexts, treated as the expected consummation of marriage. For the bride, this knowledge turned anticipation into dread, and her body into the unwilling stage upon which society enacted its rituals of union. The wedding night did not end with dawn. For many medieval women, it set the tone for the rest of their married lives. What occurred in those first hours, whether tenderness or terror, consent or coercion, echoed across years of childbearing, household labor, and the relentless expectations of family and community. The most immediate consequence was pregnancy. In a world without reliable contraception, consummation meant the likelihood of conception, often within weeks or months. A bride who had entered the chamber in fear might find herself bound even more tightly by the weight of a child. Fertility was not merely a personal matter, it was a measure of a wife's success. If a child did not come, suspicions rose. If one did, the burden of motherhood fell upon her regardless of her age, strength, or desire. Childbirth was the great trial of medieval womanhood. Medical texts and midwives' manuals testify to the dangers: obstructed labor, infection, hemorrhage. Mortality rates were high, especially for young brides whose bodies were not yet mature. For many, the dread of the wedding night was a prelude to the deeper dread of the birthing chamber. In both spaces, the bed of consummation and the stool of labor, the woman's body bore the risks, while society claimed the benefits. The emotional legacy was equally profound. A woman who endured a violent or humiliating wedding night often carried mistrust into her marriage. Husbands were rarely trained in gentleness, and the culture of male dominance left little room for a woman's needs. Marriage manuals advised wives to obey, to endure in silence, and to cultivate patience. Few spoke of mutual affection. If love grew, it was despite the structures of the age, not because of them. The household itself reinforced these patterns. In noble estates, the bride entered her husband's domain under the eyes of his kin and servants. In peasant cottages, she joined her husband's family, often living with parents-in-law who monitored her behavior. In both settings, her authority was limited until she produced children, preferably sons. The wedding night had initiated her into this new role, and every day afterward reminded her of the expectations first placed upon her body. Court cases reveal how disputes over consummation could haunt a marriage. If a husband later sought annulment or remarriage, he might claim that consummation had never truly taken place, or that the wife had resisted. Conversely, wives who tried to escape unhappy marriages were often trapped by the fact that they had been known by their husbands. The single act of the first night, recorded in gossip, in sheets or in memory, was enough to bind them for life. Religious life also colored the experience. Confessors reminded women that sex was permitted only within marriage and only for the sake of children. Pleasure for its own sake was suspect. Thus, even if a husband was kind, a wife could not openly embrace desire without fearing sin. Many brides internalized this tension, feeling guilt where they might have felt joy. The dread of the wedding night therefore extended into dread of the marital bed itself, turning intimacy into obligation rather than comfort. Consider the life of a peasant woman in 14th century England. On her wedding night, she endured her husband's demands with fear. Within a year, she was pregnant. Childbirth left her weakened, but more children followed in quick succession. By her mid-20s, she had buried 2 infants and still carried the scars of labor. Her marriage, begun in dread, became a cycle of toil, pregnancy, and grief. The memory of her first night remained not as an isolated event, but as the opening of a lifetime of demands upon her body. This was the enduring legacy of the medieval wedding night. It was not merely a moment of fear, but a threshold into a life shaped by that fear, where obedience, fertility, and endurance defined a woman's worth. The dread that filled the chamber on the first night seeped into every corner of her future, binding her in ways both visible and invisible. The hatred of the medieval wedding night was not confined to one class of society. It touched noblewomen in their castles, merchant daughters in their townhouses, and peasant girls in their cottages. Yet the way it was experienced varied, shaped by the layers of wealth, power, and expectation that surrounded each bride. For noblewomen, the wedding night was a political act. Their marriages were negotiated as treaties, often across great distances. A princess of France might be sent to England, Spain, or the Holy Roman Empire, carrying with her a dowry that could alter the balance of kingdoms. On her wedding night, her body sealed that contract. The consummation of noble marriages was so politically significant that chroniclers sometimes recorded it, ambassadors confirmed it, and rivals contested it. The pressure upon the bride was immense. Her virginity, her fertility, even the bedding ceremony itself were matters of state. What for others was a private threshold became, for her, an event of international consequence. Peasant brides lived under different, though no less pressing, burdens. Their marriages were arranged within villages, often to consolidate land, livestock, or labor. Here the community's gaze was sharpest. Neighbors knew one another's business, and gossip was relentless. A peasant bride's wedding night might be mocked with songs outside the door, her sheets scrutinized the next day, her behavior discussed for months. She also knew that her ability to bear children was essential to her family's survival. Where a noblewoman carried the burden of dynastic inheritance, a peasant woman bore the burden of labor and survival. Her dread lay in the knowledge that her body was her family's most valuable resource. For townsfolk, merchants, artisans, and tradesmen, the experience fell somewhere in between. Urban brides often married into guild families, where marriage secured apprenticeships, shopwrights, and alliances between workshops. Their wedding nights were less likely to be paraded with torches and more likely to be scrutinized through legal contracts and civic records. Dowries, inheritances, and business connections rested upon successful consummation. Urban brides faced not only the fear of intimacy, but also the anxiety of financial entanglement, knowing that their households were businesses as much as homes. Across all classes, the themes of obedience and fertility were constant. Whether noble, peasant, or merchant, a bride knew that her value rested upon her ability to conceive and to endure her husband's authority. The difference lay in the scale of the consequences. For the noblewoman, a failed consummation could spark war. For the peasant woman, it could mean ridicule and poverty. For the merchant's daughter, it could unravel contracts and ruin fortunes. The physical settings reflected these differences. A noble bride might enter a chamber hung with tapestries, watched over by ladies-in-waiting, and later subject to political scrutiny of her sheets. A peasant bride might lie on straw in a crowded cottage, with neighbors singing outside and children peeking through cracks in the wall. A merchant's bride might share a chamber above a shop, the smells of leather or spices drifting up from below. Each setting carried its own form of pressure, but none offered true privacy. Imagine 3 brides on the same evening, one in a castle in Burgundy, another in a village in Saxony, a third in a London townhouse. Each faces her husband with fear. Each carries into that moment the weight of family and community. Each dreads the same things: pain, humiliation, loss of control, though the stakes differ. Together they illustrate the universality of the medieval bride's plight. No matter her station, the wedding night was never her own. This comparison across classes reveals that while circumstances varied, the underlying dread was woven into the very structure of medieval marriage. The union of man and woman was not only personal but political, economic, and communal. And in each case, it was the bride who bore the heaviest burden, her body the seal of agreements that reached far beyond her chamber walls. The Church's influence reached into every corner of medieval marriage, and the wedding night was no exception. What might seem to modern minds a private act was tightly bound by liturgy, calendars, and rules that dictated when, how, and why sex could take place. For newlyweds, these teachings turned the chamber into a site not just of intimacy, but of theology. First, the liturgy itself. At the altar, the priest blessed the union with words that reminded the couple that marriage was ordained not for pleasure, but for procreation and mutual support. Some priests even blessed the marriage bed, sprinkling holy water upon it before the couple entered. This ritual sanctified the chamber, but it also laid down the expectation. What happened there must serve God's purpose. A bride, already anxious, was made to feel that her body was not only her husband's possession, but also God's instrument. The calendar of feasts and fasts further restricted newlyweds. Medieval penitential texts listed long periods when sex was forbidden: Lent, Advent, certain saints' days, and even the nights before receiving communion. Some manuals counted more than 100 days a year when intercourse was prohibited. For a bride, this meant that her first night might be shadowed by uncertainty. Was it permitted on this day? Was it sinful? Husbands and priests did not always agree, leaving the woman caught between obligation and fear of sin. Beyond the calendar lay the doctrine of the marital debt. Canon law taught that spouses owed each other sex upon request. A bride, even on her first night, was expected to render this debt if her husband asked. Failure could be a sin, unless excused by illness or religious duty. The husband's right to ask was emphasized more than the wife's. For many brides, this turned the marriage bed into a ledger, where intimacy was measured as obligation rather than choice. Confession manuals reveal how seriously this was taken. Priests asked wives whether they had resisted their husband's advances, whether they had withheld themselves without good reason, whether they had sought pleasure for its own sake. The scrutiny was relentless, and it reinforced the idea that the wedding night was not about affection, but about fulfilling a duty to both husband and God. There was also the tension between purity and lust. Church fathers like Augustine and later Aquinas warned that sex, even within marriage, could be tainted by excessive desire. A bride was urged to approach her husband with modesty, to seek not passion but procreation. At the same time, she was told that pleasure was necessary for conception. The contradiction was maddening. Too little desire risked barrenness, too much risked sin. For a woman entering marriage with no education about her body, these competing messages could make the wedding night feel like a trap with no escape. Imagine a young couple in 13th century Italy. They are married during Advent, when sermons thunder against indulgence. The bride knows that her husband expects consummation, but she also recalls the priest's warning that fleshly union in this holy season offends God. She hesitates, torn between fear of her husband's anger and fear of divine judgment. Her dread is doubled, not only of the act itself, but of the sin she may incur simply by obeying. Thus, the Church's teachings did not simply hover in the background, they directly shaped the experience of the wedding night. They dictated the times, the motives, and even the emotions deemed acceptable. For brides, this meant that the most intimate moment of their lives was haunted by the heavy hand of theology, turning fear into a kind of spiritual burden as well as a physical one. While law and liturgy weighed heavily upon the medieval bride, folklore and legend added another layer of fear. Tales circulated in villages, courts, and chronicles, some grounded in fragments of truth, others born from rumor or imagination. These stories shaped how women anticipated their wedding nights, amplifying dread even when the actual practices were less extreme. One of the most enduring myths is the so-called droit du seigneur, the alleged right of a lord to sleep with a vassal's bride on her wedding night. Modern historians agree that no such universal legal right existed, yet the legend was powerful. It appeared in later medieval and Renaissance literature, whispered in villages as a symbol of aristocratic exploitation. Even if no lord ever demanded such a privilege in law, the belief that he could haunted the imagination. For peasant brides, the rumor alone was terrifying. To marry under a lord's authority was already to yield rents and services. To imagine that he might also claim one's body on the most intimate of nights turned anxiety into horror. Other stories dwelt on supernatural dangers. Folklore in parts of Germany and Scandinavia warned brides of spirits or demons that lurked on wedding nights, eager to ensnare them. These tales served both as cautionary warnings against lust and as expressions of the deep fear surrounding first sexual encounters. Some believed that witches or envious neighbors might cast spells upon the marriage bed, rendering the couple infertile or causing the wife to suffer in childbirth. To ward off such dangers, charms were sometimes placed beneath the sheets or prayers recited as the couple entered the chamber. Yet for the bride, the knowledge that unseen forces might conspire against her added to the already heavy weight of dread. Legends of saints also played their part. Hagiographies celebrated holy women who resisted consummation altogether, choosing virginity for Christ over submission to a husband. Stories of St. Agnes, St. Cecilia, and countless others depicted brides who prayed for divine rescue and were miraculously preserved. While such tales inspired devotion, they also reinforced the sense that the wedding night was a perilous trial from which only heaven could deliver. Ordinary women, lacking the miracle of angelic intervention, faced the ordeal with no escape but endurance. Bawdy tales and fabliaux, popular among men, mocked women's fears and turned them into entertainment. These stories portrayed brides as timid, foolish, or reluctant, while clever husbands or lusty clerics overcame their resistance. Though meant to amuse, such tales taught men to dismiss a woman's hesitation as laughable. For brides, the knowledge that their reluctance might be mocked in song or story added humiliation to fear. Even within families, cautionary stories circulated. Mothers might whisper to daughters about painful first nights, about neighbors who were shamed for failing to bleed, about cousins who nearly died in childbirth after a marriage too early. Whether embellished or not, These stories passed through generations, shaping expectations long before the wedding day. The chamber, therefore, was haunted not only by theology and law, but by the voices of kin and community retelling their own anxieties. Imagine a bride in a small Burgundian village. As she sits at the feast, she hears the laughter of men telling bawdy tales of reluctant wives. Later, when she's led toward the chamber, a neighbor teases that the Lord may come knocking. Her mother at her side presses a charm of herbs into her hand, warning that witches might envy her youth. By the time she reaches the bed, she carries with her not only her own fears, but the weight of stories, rumors, and legends layered upon her since childhood. This folklore reveals how the medieval imagination magnified dread, whether through myths of lordly privilege, fears of demons, tales of saints, or bawdy jokes. The cultural landscape framed the wedding night as a moment of peril. Even if no demon appeared, no lord intruded, and no witch cast a spell, the bride entered the chamber convinced that forces beyond her control, earthly or supernatural, were waiting in the shadows. Literature and art in the Middle Ages both reflected and reinforced the dread that surrounded wedding nights. What brides feared privately was echoed, distorted, and often mocked in the cultural products of their age. These works shaped how men thought about marriage, how women prepared for it, and how society justified the structures that left brides with so little power. In vernacular literature, especially the fabliaux of France, the wedding night was often portrayed as comic farce. Tales delighted in exposing the ignorance of young brides or in celebrating the sexual prowess of husbands. A nervous wife might be depicted as foolish for resisting, only to be educated by her husband's insistence. While such stories may have been told for laughter, their underlying message was clear. Women's reluctance was not to be respected, but to be overcome. For real brides, such tales turned private fear into public entertainment. Courtly romances offered a different but equally problematic model. They celebrated love and chivalry, yet still assumed obedience. A knight's devotion might win a lady's favor, but once marriage occurred, her role was to yield. In these stories, consummation was often glossed over, but its absence was sometimes the source of tension or conflict. By idealizing the union yet ignoring its realities, romances painted marriage as a dream for men, leaving women to live the harsher truth. Religious literature added another voice. Sermons warned against lust, yet also mocked wives who resisted their husbands. Preachers used earthy metaphors to remind congregations of the debt owed between spouses, sometimes joking at the expense of women's reluctance. While framed as moral instruction, these sermons reinforced the idea that a bride's duty outweighed her fear. Visual art contributed to the climate of expectation. Illuminated manuscripts sometimes depicted Adam and Eve's union or allegories of marriage, always placing the woman in a passive role. Marginal drawings in manuscripts occasionally featured obscene jokes at brides' expense, reducing their fear to comedy. Even marriage charters and documents decorated with symbolic images emphasized fertility and lineage rather than companionship. The cultural message was consistent. A wife's body was a tool for family and society, not her own possession. Music, too, carried these themes. Wedding songs, some preserved in manuscripts, often combined blessings with bawdy humor. Chants or carols wished the couple fertility, but also teased the bride about her innocence. These songs, sung at feasts and processions, made sure that everyone, from lords to peasants, understood consummation as a communal matter. For the bride, hearing her private fears turned into lyrics reinforced her sense of exposure. There were, however, countercurrents. Certain devotional texts and saints' lives elevated virginity as the highest state, portraying women who resisted marriage as holy. Yet even these works offered little comfort to the ordinary bride, for they did not suggest mutuality in marriage, only that complete refusal of the wedding night was a miracle or a mark of sanctity. The vast majority of women could not take such a path. Imagine a literate bride in 14th century Florence. She has read romances where knights adore their ladies, yet she has also overheard Fabio mocking wives as timid fools. At her wedding feast, musicians sing verses half prayer and half jest. On the table beside her lies a book of hours, decorated with images of Eve's submission to Adam. By the time she enters her chamber, she has already absorbed a cultural script that tells her she must yield, that her reluctance is laughable, and that her duty is divine. Thus, art and literature did not merely mirror private dread, they magnified it. They gave men permission to dismiss women's fears, and they gave women reason to believe those fears were inescapable. The chamber, already burdened with family, law, and community, was crowded also with the voices of poets, preachers, artists, and singers, all insisting that the bride's body was never her own. Though the weight of law, custom, and culture bore heavily upon brides, not every woman accepted her fate in silence. Some resisted openly, others quietly negotiated, and a few found ways to reclaim limited agency within the rigid structures of medieval marriage. Their stories remind us that dread was not always met with passive endurance. It could also provoke courage, cunning, or subtle defiance. One form of resistance came before the wedding night itself. Some women petitioned ecclesiastical courts to annul unwanted marriages on grounds of coercion, pre-contract, or kinship too close to permit union. Records from English and French dioceses reveal women who declared that they were forced to speak vows through fear and compulsion. If they succeeded, they escaped consummation altogether. Yet such victories were rare. More often, courts dismissed the plea once the marriage was consummated, proving how decisive that first night was. Others resisted through vows of chastity. In both hagiographies and real court petitions, women sometimes claimed that they had dedicated themselves to virginity, seeking to live as brother and sister within marriage. Some husbands reluctantly agreed, fearing sin if they pressed further. Others refused, forcing consummation despite the vow. Still, the persistence of this strategy shows that some women tried to carve out space for themselves, appealing to the Church's reverence for virginity as a shield against marital demands. Subtler forms of negotiation took place within households. A bride who could not refuse outright might bargain with timing, using the church calendar of forbidden days to delay. She might feign illness, invoke religious observances, or arrange her tasks so as to postpone her husband's approach. These tactics, though fragile, gave her moments of reprieve. In some cases, if affection grew, wives were able to shape intimacy into something gentler, turning dread into endurance, and endurance into companionship. We also find traces of women using humor or wit to reclaim dignity. Biblios and household tales sometimes depict clever wives who turned the tables on husbands, tricking them or controlling access to the marriage bed. While these stories were often told by men for men, their survival suggests that audiences recognized women's potential to resist through intelligence rather than submission. In noble courts, resistance could take the form of political maneuvering. A lady with powerful kin might delay consummation until dowries were fully paid or conditions met. Queens and princesses occasionally used the absence of consummation as leverage in disputes between kingdoms. Their ability to resist came not from personal freedom, but from the political weight their bodies carried. Even so, these examples show that some women managed to negotiate the timing and terms of their wedding nights. The Church, paradoxically, sometimes offered tools for agency. While it demanded obedience, it also enshrined the principle of mutual consent. A bride could claim that her marriage was invalid if she had never truly agreed. A wife could petition for annulment if her husband was impotent or violent. Though success was uncertain, these legal mechanisms gave women at least a theoretical voice. In the cracks of the system, some found room to assert themselves. Imagine a young woman in 14th century Castile. Married by arrangement, she whispers to her husband on their wedding night that she has taken a vow of chastity. He hesitates, fearing sin if he forces her. They live together as companions, managing household affairs, but she avoids the fate of childbearing that killed her sisters. Her story would have been rare, yet not impossible, an example of how faith, family dynamics and circumstance could sometimes combine to grant a bride agency where none seemed possible. These acts of resistance, whether great or small, remind us that medieval women were not merely passive victims of their circumstances. They navigated the dangers of the wedding night with whatever tools they had: law, religion, cunning, delay, or negotiation. Yet the very need for such strategies underscores how deeply the system was stacked against them. Their dread was justified, but their courage was real. The medieval wedding night was more than a private moment between husband and wife. It was the pivot upon which law, theology, family honor, and community expectation all turned. For the bride, it marked not the beginning of a partnership, but the surrender of autonomy. Her body transformed into a site of proof, performance, and obligation. The dread she carried was not born of superstition alone, but of lived reality. Fear of pain, of humiliation, of violence, of failure, of judgment, and of a lifetime sealed by a single night. The testimonies of courts, the prescriptions of priests, the theories of physicians, and the laughter of neighbors all converged on the chamber. Each voice demanded something of the bride. The priest demanded obedience to God's law. The physician demanded fertility through pleasure she was never taught to understand. The family demanded heirs to secure their lineage. The community demanded proof of consummation. And the husband, armed with law and custom, demanded submission. Against such a chorus, the bride's own voice was nearly silent. Yet the echoes of that silence resound through history. For every Margaret Beaufort, whose early pregnancy scarred her body, there were countless unnamed peasant women who endured in obscurity. For every princess whose sheets were paraded before ambassadors, there were countless village brides whose neighbors mocked or scrutinized them. Across class and culture, the themes were the same: a lack of choice, a burden of expectation, and a night shadowed by fear. And yet, as we have seen, there were also moments of resistance. Some women appealed to courts, others invoked vows of chastity. Still others carved space for themselves through wit or negotiation. These acts remind us that medieval women were not simply acted upon. They acted, however, constrained. Their courage was often quiet, their victories fleeting, but their struggle for dignity was real. The legacy of these nights endures in our fascination today. Modern readers, accustomed to the ideal of mutual consent, recoil at the structures that left brides so vulnerable. The dread of medieval women illuminates not only the cruelty of the past, but also the long journey toward a concept of marriage built on equality. Their stories warn us how fragile that concept can be, how easily intimacy can be twisted by power, how important it is to safeguard choice. Imagine, finally, one more bride, anonymous, perhaps from a small English village around 1300. Her wedding feast has ended, the torches have burned low, the neighbors have drifted away. She sits on the edge of a straw bed, clutching the linen that will be inspected tomorrow. She hears her husband's footsteps, feels the weight of all the expectations pressing upon her. She is frightened, yet she cannot refuse. In that moment, her dread is the distilled essence of centuries of practice, law, and belief. She is one woman, but she carries the weight of an entire world. This is why medieval women would have hated their wedding nights, because the night was never truly theirs. It belonged to families, to priests, to neighbors, to doctors, to law, and above all to a system that measured their worth by their ability to bleed, to submit, and to bear. Their fear was not weakness, it was wisdom in the face of a world that gave them little mercy. And their silence, though forced, continues to speak to us, reminding us of the human cost hidden beneath the rituals of history. The dread of the medieval wedding night did not end at the chamber door, nor did it belong to women alone. Husbands, too, lived within a system that distorted intimacy into duty and proof. To understand fully why brides suffered, one must also consider how men were shaped, how they were trained to expect obedience, how they bore the burden of lineage, and how their fears, though different, intersected with their wives' dread. Young men of the nobility were often raised with the knowledge that marriage was a political act. A knight might be told since boyhood that his future wife would come with lands, alliances, or money, and that consummation was the seal of these arrangements. Rather than learning how to nurture affection, he was taught that the chamber was a test of his virility and a demonstration of his family's honor. Just as women faced suspicion if they did not bleed, men faced ridicule if they failed to perform. Chroniclers sometimes mocked noble grooms whose impotence left dynastic unions unfulfilled. The humiliation was not private. It could end a career or invite lawsuits. This pressure did not erase the imbalance of power. Husbands could compel where wives could not, yet it did twist the wedding night into a test for both. The bride feared pain and loss of autonomy, the groom feared failure and dishonor. Both entered the chamber under the shadow of expectation. Rarely did either come prepared for tenderness. Among peasants, the burdens were different. A husband's primary concern was fertility and labor. He needed a wife to bear children who could help in the fields, to join households that ensured survival. His masculinity was measured not by gallantry, but by his ability to father strong heirs. Here again, consummation was treated as proof. If years passed without children, tongues wagged. Villagers might whisper of witchcraft, curses, or the wife's supposed coldness. Sometimes the blame fell on the husband, but more often suspicion turned toward the woman. Religious instruction reinforced these pressures. Confession manuals told men that they must not neglect their wives' needs. But in practice, priests emphasized a husband's rights. A groom, hearing these teachings, might approach the bed, convinced that his demand was not only permitted, but righteous. Fear of sin, lust, adultery, impotence, intertwined with fear of social shame. Husbands, too, carried anxiety into the chamber, though theirs translated into pressure to act, not permission to resist. There are glimpses, however, of tenderness breaking through. Letters between some couples reveal affection, even love. In noble courts, where literacy was higher, husbands sometimes expressed concern for their wives' health or sorrow at their suffering in childbirth. These moments remind us that not all marriages were devoid of compassion. Yet they were exceptions within a system designed to prioritize lineage and authority over mutual care. Imagine a groom in late 13th century Brabant. He is 25, newly married to a girl of 15. His uncles drink in the hall, waiting for proof of consummation. He knows that if he fails, his family's rivals will mock him. He has been taught nothing of patience, nothing of easing fear. To him, the act is an ordeal he must accomplish. To her, it is an ordeal she must endure. Both are trapped by a culture that has turned intimacy into a test. Thus, when we extend our gaze, we see that dread was not confined to women alone. Husbands, too, were burdened, though their burdens granted them power rather than robbed them of it. The tragedy lies in how both were shaped by expectation, forced into roles that left little room for tenderness or consent. The medieval wedding night was not only a sight of women's fear, but of a larger distortion of human connection, where duty eclipsed desire and proof mattered more than love. If dread marked the chamber, its echoes carried into the rhythms of daily married life. The wedding night was only the first act in a long play of expectations that structured the relationship between husband and wife. To understand why that first night weighed so heavily, we must see how it shaped everything that followed. The first consequence was the rhythm of pregnancy and childbirth. Medieval medicine taught that wives should conceive quickly, and families expected it. A bride who remained barren after her wedding night was soon the subject of whispers. Neighbors might say she had resisted her husband, or that she was cursed, or that she had failed to reach the pleasure physicians claimed was necessary for conception. The failure to produce children was rarely blamed on the man. Instead, the woman carried the weight of suspicion. Thus, from the very first night onward, she lived with the fear of being judged not only for her performance, but for the fruit it bore. Childbearing was both duty and danger. The average medieval woman might give birth to 6, 8, or even 10 children. Many did not survive infancy. Many mothers died in childbirth. For a girl married young, the risks were even greater. If her wedding night left her pregnant before her body was ready, the ordeal could be fatal. Stories of noblewomen who perished after early marriages, like Isabel of Valois, married to England as Richard II at age 6, and widowed by 12, circulated as grim reminders of the risks of early unions. For common women, their stories were not recorded, but the risks were just as real. The dread of that first night also lingered in the patterns of obedience expected of wives. Marriage manuals advised women to be silent, patient, and yielding. A wife was instructed to accept her husband's authority in all things: food, clothing, household labor, and of course intimacy. If she resisted, she risked not only her husband's anger, but the community's censure. A woman who spoke out or refused was seen as disobedient, even sinful. In this way, the wedding night initiated her into a lifetime of submission. In-laws often reinforced these expectations. A bride who entered her husband's family home quickly learned that her behavior was scrutinized. Mothers-in-law might demand evidence of fertility. Fathers-in-law might enforce obedience. Servants and neighbors carried gossip from chamber to village. Even if a husband was kind, the household around him might treat the bride with suspicion until she had proven herself as a fertile and obedient wife. The wedding night was the beginning of this long probation, and its outcome shaped how she was treated thereafter. The dread also extended to the rituals of religion. Confession placed women under the scrutiny of priests who asked probing questions about their marital lives. A wife might be asked whether she refused her husband's advances, whether she sought pleasure improperly, whether she obeyed the laws of the church regarding fasting days. These questions made her private life a matter of spiritual discipline. The fear she felt on her wedding night, the fear of failing in her role, was reinforced every time she knelt in the confessional. Imagine a bride in 15th century Florence. On her wedding night, she endured her husband's insistence despite fear. Within months she was pregnant. Her labor was long and dangerous. She barely survived. The priest who visited her afterward reminded her that bearing children was her sacred duty, that suffering in childbirth was Eve's curse. She lived on, but each pregnancy renewed the fear planted on her wedding night. The dread did not end in that first chamber. It returned again and again, each time she lay down beside her husband, each time her belly swelled, each time the midwife prepared her for delivery. This continuity shows why the wedding night loomed so large in memory. It was not only a single fearful moment, but the opening chapter of a life where a woman's worth was measured by her obedience, her fertility, and her endurance. The dread she felt that night became the pattern of her days, shaping not only her body, but her place within her family and community. If the wedding night was the threshold, then childbirth was its inevitable consequence, and it was in the birthing chamber that the dread of women most fully ripened. For medieval brides, the terror of consummation was often inseparable from the terror of bearing the children that society demanded. The dangers were immense. Mortality rates in childbirth were high, especially for young brides whose bodies had not matured. Midwives knew the signs of obstructed labor, of hemorrhage, of fevers that followed delivery, but their remedies were limited. Physicians sometimes prescribed herbal concoctions or prayers, but the outcome often rested on chance. For every noblewoman like Margaret Beaufort, who nearly died at 13 giving birth, there were countless peasant women whose names never reached a chronicle, their lives cut short in the very act that society called their duty. The Church framed this suffering as both curse and blessing. Preachers reminded women of Eve's sin. In sorrow shalt thou bring forth children. Labor pains were taught as punishment for humanity's fall. At the same time, motherhood was exalted as a holy calling, a means of sanctification through suffering. To endure childbirth bravely was to imitate the martyrs. In this paradox, a woman's fear was not only natural but sanctified. Her agony was proof of piety. Such teaching began with the wedding night. From the first act of consummation, a bride knew that pain lay ahead. She might have seen her mother weakened by repeated births or her sister buried after a difficult labor. She entered the marriage bed not only with fear of her husband's demands, but with the haunting knowledge that those demands would soon carry her to the birthing stool. The dread of the first night was inseparable from the dread of many nights to come. Communities reinforced this cycle. A woman who failed to conceive was whispered about as barren. One who conceived too often might die young. Either way, she was judged. Midwives sometimes examined wives accused of hiding pregnancies or practicing contraception. Rumors of potions and charms to prevent conception circulated, but these were dangerous to use and condemned by the Church. For most women, there was no escape from the cycle of fear. The wedding night led to pregnancy, and pregnancy led to the perils of childbirth. The medical texts of the time reflect both care and cruelty. Compilations like the Trotula, a widely read collection of women's medicine, gave instructions on easing labor pains and healing after birth. Yet, these same texts also discussed ways to test virginity or detect adultery, treating women's bodies as problems to be solved rather than persons to be cherished. For the bride, this meant that from her first night onward, her body was subject to constant scrutiny, not only from husband and priest, but from midwife and physician as well. Imagine a young woman in 14th century York. Her wedding night left her pregnant within a month. By the time she was 16, she was preparing for childbirth. The midwife offered charms and whispered prayers, but the girl had already seen 2 neighbors die in labor that year. As she lay on the birthing stool, she remembered the fear she felt on her wedding night, and she realized it had never left her. The chamber of consummation and the chamber of childbirth were bound together by dread, one flowing inexorably into the other. The connection between these spaces, the bed and the birthing stool, reveals why medieval women dreaded marriage so deeply. It was not a single night of fear, but a lifetime of cycles, of pain, of danger, of judgment. Their suffering was normalized by religion, rationalized by medicine, and reinforced by custom. The wedding night was only the beginning of a road lined with peril. The dread of the wedding night often cast shadows far into a woman's later life, shaping her memory of marriage, her role as a widow, and her prospects if remarriage followed. To understand its lasting legacy, we must look at how women carried the weight of that first night into middle age and beyond. Widowhood was a frequent reality in medieval Europe. War, disease, and the hazards of travel often left women bereft of husbands at relatively young ages. For many, this brought both grief and relief. Some widows mourned sincerely, bound by affection or duty. Others quietly welcomed freedom from the demands of marriage. Chroniclers note widows who resisted remarriage fiercely, citing vows of chastity or devotion to God. Behind such choices often lay the memory of fear. The wedding night had taught them how little control they had in marriage, and widowhood offered a rare escape. The church sometimes celebrated this refusal. Widows who chose celibacy were praised for dedicating themselves to prayer and charity. In saints' lives, widows often appear as paragons of piety, refusing new husbands in favor of holy service. Yet for many ordinary women, economic pressures forced remarriage. A widow with young children, lacking property or protection, might be compelled to accept another husband. This meant facing once more the dread she had known as a bride, the expectation of obedience, of consummation, of childbirth. In noble households, remarriage was often a matter of politics. A young widow with a substantial dowry or estate was highly desirable. Kings and lords arranged second and third marriages as readily as first ones, often with little regard for the widow's wishes. Chroniclers tell of widows like Eleanor of Aquitaine, married first to Louis VII of France and later to Henry II of England, whose unions were as much about kingdoms as companionship. For women of lesser rank, the same principle held. Widows were bargaining pieces, their bodies once again the seals of contracts. The dread of the wedding night thus returned with remarriage. Even if a widow had endured childbirth and gained experience, the social scripts did not change. She was expected to yield, to conceive again, to submit. The fears of pain or danger remained, particularly as age compounded the risks of pregnancy. For some, the thought of reliving that first ordeal was unbearable. Memory itself was another burden. Women often carried the memory of their first night as a mark of transition, from girlhood to womanhood, from daughter to wife. In songs and stories, older women sometimes warned the young of what awaited them, passing down their dread in whispered counsel. These memories kept alive the cultural expectation that the wedding night was a moment of fear, not of joy. Even widows who refused remarriage could not always escape judgment. Communities sometimes viewed them with suspicion, accusing them of being ungoverned or unruly. A woman who claimed her body for herself disrupted the social order. Her refusal to re-enter the cycle of marriage and consummation was read as defiance. For this reason, many widows cloaked their resistance in the language of religion, presenting their choice as piety rather than rebellion. Imagine a widow in 15th century France. Married at 14, she bore 6 children before her husband died in his 30s. Now, in her mid-20s, she is courted by a merchant who sees her dowry and her sons as assets. Her family urges her to remarry for security, yet she remembers her wedding night, the fear, the lack of choice, the years of pregnancy and loss. She resists, insisting she has vowed herself to God. Whether her vow is sincere or a shield, the truth is the same. She dreads returning to that chamber, and she will risk poverty to avoid it. In widowhood and remarriage, we see how the dread of the wedding night was not a passing fear, but a lifelong condition. It shaped choices, fueled resistance, and lingered in memory. Even when the husband was gone, the shadow of that first night remained. A reminder of the system that had claimed a woman's body from the moment she entered her marriage bed. The dread surrounding medieval wedding nights cannot be separated from the broader political and legal frameworks that gave consummation such weight. These structures, inheritance laws, dowry contracts, dynastic strategies, transformed private intimacy into public business. For brides, the chamber was not merely a place of union, but a courtroom, a counting house, and a battlefield of lineage. Inheritance law was at the heart of this pressure. In noble families, the legitimacy of heirs determined the future of entire estates or kingdoms. A marriage unconsummated could be contested, annulled, or declared void, leaving claims uncertain. Consummation, by contrast, sealed the bond in the eyes of the law. This explains why witnesses were sometimes called to confirm that a marriage had been completed, or why sheets were displayed as evidence. The bride's body became the final legal instrument of transfer, more binding than parchment or seal, Dowries intensified this burden. Families gave property, money or goods with their daughters, expecting in return security and alliances. If a marriage was never consummated, disputes erupted over whether dowries should be returned. Lawsuits from Italy, France and England revealed fathers and brothers dragging unwilling brides into court, demanding proof that their contributions had not been wasted. For the young women at the center, the wedding night was thus the hinge upon which fortunes turned. At the dynastic level, the stakes rose even higher. Consider the case of Catherine of Aragon and Arthur, Prince of Wales, in the early 16th century. Their marriage was short, and Arthur's early death left questions about whether consummation had occurred. This detail, whether a teenager and his bride had truly shared a bed, later determined whether Catherine's subsequent marriage to Henry VIII was valid and whether England would remain in communion with Rome. The fate of a kingdom hinged upon the most intimate of acts, magnifying the pressure that countless brides felt in less exalted circumstances. Even among peasants, legal structures mattered. Customary law often required consummation for a marriage to be recognized by the community. Without it, unions could be contested, children declared illegitimate, inheritances denied. Villagers might not draw up contracts as nobles did, but they relied on gossip, witness, and ritual to ensure that marriages were binding. For a peasant bride, the fear was not of lawsuits in distant courts, but of losing her place in the village order. The law also enshrined the doctrine of coverture. Upon marriage, a woman's legal identity merged with her husband's. She could no longer own property independently or represent herself in court. Consummation marked the moment when this legal transformation became absolute. Thus, the wedding night was not merely physical submission, it was the erasure of legal autonomy. A bride crossed a threshold where she ceased to exist as an independent actor in the eyes of the law. Dynastic politics could make the ordeal even more ruthless. Royal marriages often involved children or very young adolescents, united not for affection but to secure treaties. Chroniclers describe ambassadors waiting anxiously for confirmation of consummation, knowing that a failed union could unravel alliances. For the bride, this meant that her body was the frontier of diplomacy. She was not only a wife, but a guarantor of peace or war. Imagine a princess of Navarre in the late 14th century sent to wed a French prince. At 12, she enters the chamber knowing that her marriage will secure a treaty between kingdoms. Courtiers whisper outside, ready to record whether the union has been fulfilled. She has no understanding of politics, only fear. Yet her small frame carries the weight of two realms. Her dread is not only personal, it is geopolitical. These structures explain why dread was universal. It was not just the fear of pain, of blood, or of coercion. It was the knowledge that a single night could decide dowries, inheritances, treaties, and dynasties. The medieval bride was both woman and instrument, her body the ledger upon which law and politics were written. In this way, the private dread of the chamber was amplified by the vast machinery of medieval society, turning fear into a force that touched kingdoms as well as cottages. When we step back from the detail, the court records, the sermons, the folklore, the chambers of both noble castles and peasant cottages, we see the medieval wedding night not as a single event, but as a nexus. It was the point where law, theology, medicine, family strategy, and community ritual converged upon the body of a woman. And because all of these forces demanded proof, submission, and fertility, it is little wonder that dread was the dominant emotion carried into that night. The night itself was layered with fear. There was fear of physical pain, especially for young brides married before their bodies were ready. There was fear of failure, not bleeding, not conceiving, not proving virginity. There was fear of sin, tangled in the church's contradictory teachings that demanded both modesty and responsiveness. There was fear of ridicule, knowing neighbors might gossip or laugh about what had, or had not, occurred. And there was fear of permanence, That once consummation had taken place, escape through annulment or appeal was nearly impossible. But beyond fear, there was also endurance. Women did not live in dread alone, they lived through it. They bore children, raised households, managed estates, and sometimes wielded quiet influence. Some resisted through vows of chastity, appeals to courts, or clever negotiation. Others found tenderness within arranged unions, discovering affection where none had been expected. Dread may have been the beginning, but it was not always the end. Still, the fact that so much of a woman's life hinged on a night she often entered unwillingly remains a testament to how deeply her world was shaped by forces beyond her control. The legacy of these nights is instructive. They reveal how marriage, so often romanticized in modern memory, was historically an institution of power, designed less for companionship than for lineage, alliance, and control. They remind us how theology and law can distort intimacy, turning consent into obligation and affection into duty. They show us how communities, by demanding proof and gossiping about performance, intruded upon spaces that should have been private. Most of all, they remind us of the silence of women in history. The voices of brides rarely survive in their own words. We glimpse them through court records, medical texts, and the judgments of men, yet the very absence of their words speaks volumes. It tells us that their fear, though rarely recorded, was real. It tells us that behind the rituals, beneath the contracts, within the chambers, there were young women whose lives were being reshaped in ways they could not choose. Imagine, finally, one last bride. She could be from a village in England, a merchant household in Flanders, or a noble court in Castile. She sits on the edge of her bed, her hands trembling, her mind filled with everything she has been told. To bleed, to obey, to conceive, to avoid sin, to prove herself. She hears her husband approach, hears laughter outside the door, feels the weight of God, family and law pressing in. In that moment she is every bride of her age. Her dread is not hers alone. It belongs to the system that has claimed her. This is why medieval women hated their wedding nights. Because they were not nights of union but of submission, not nights of love but of proof, not beginnings of partnership but inaugurations of burden. They were nights where women crossed a threshold into lives defined by others' expectations, carrying with them fear that never fully faded. And yet, in remembering that dread today, we honor their endurance. By acknowledging the weight they bore, we give voice to their silence. By naming their fear, we recover their humanity from beneath the rituals of history. Their wedding nights were heavy with dread, but their lives and their survival testify to resilience in the face of a system that demanded everything and gave so little in return.